The morning sunlight reflected off the sleek windows of Legacy Trust Bank, casting long shadows across the bustling downtown street. Sarah Chen Williams stepped out of her Tesla Model Y, adjusting the collar of her worn yet stylish blazer. The vintage piece wasn't just clothing. It was a silent reminder of her journey, from rejection to dominance in an industry that once turned its back on her. At 42, with silver strands crowning her neatly braided hair, Sarah wore her success with quiet pride. She had built her empire brick by brick, fueled by perseverance and an unyielding determination to prove that no door could stay shut forever. The air outside was crisp, filled with the scent of street vendor hot dogs and the chatter of early morning commuters. In her designer bag rested a check for $2.3 million, a symbol of her latest victory in the world of fintech acquisitions. She could have sent it electronically, as most would, but Sarah believed in staying connected to the roots of her business. She understood the importance of experiencing firsthand what her customers went through, walking the same floors she once stood on as a young woman clutching rejected loan applications. Inside the bank, Thomas Barrett, the recently promoted branch manager, stood surveying the lobby with an air of practiced authority. His sharp suit and meticulously groomed appearance projected an image of control, though his demeanor carried a subtle edge. For 15 years, Barrett had prided himself on his ability to spot discrepancies, to discern truth from deception with an almost instinctive precision. To him, every customer was a potential risk until proven otherwise, a lesson ingrained during his long climb up the corporate ladder. When Sarah entered the bank, her presence turned heads, though not in the way she might have expected. Her casual sneakers and understated demeanor contrasted sharply with the polished clientele usually seen in such institutions. Barrett's eyes followed her movements, his gut instinct raising silent alarms. Something about her seemed off, though he couldn't quite place it. As Sarah approached the teller's counter, she greeted the young employee with a warm smile and slid the check across the desk. The teller, Jenny Martinez, froze momentarily as her eyes scanned the amount written on the paper. Her breath hitched, and her hands trembled slightly, betraying her inexperience. Before Sarah could say more, Barrett appeared, his presence towering over both women. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone laced with polite suspicion. He barely glanced at Sarah before focusing on the check, lifting it delicately as though it might reveal its secrets under closer scrutiny. "It's a significant transaction," Barrett remarked, his voice measured but firm. "We'll need to verify some details." Sarah nodded calmly and handed over her ID without hesitation. Her composure only deepened Barrett's skepticism. The sum was enormous, the check pristine, and everything about her seemed too perfect, too practiced. Barrett's instincts screamed fraud. "I think it's best we continue this conversation in my office," he said, gesturing toward a glass-walled room at the back of the branch. Sarah followed without protest, her expression unreadable. Inside the office, Barrett scrutinized the check under the harsh light of his desk lamp, his fingers drumming a steady rhythm on the polished surface. He questioned her relentlessly about the check, the company, and her reasons for depositing it at this particular branch. Each answer Sarah gave was calm and precise, yet it only fueled Barrett's doubts. His gaze flickered to the silent alarm button beneath his desk, his hand hovering close as he weighed his options. "Ms. Williams," he began, his tone shifting to one of barely concealed authority, "this is a highly unusual transaction. Given the amount involved, I'm afraid I'll need to involve law enforcement to verify its legitimacy." Sarah's gaze didn't falter. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, exuding an air of quiet confidence that unsettled Barrett even further. "Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice steady, "I think you're making assumptions that could be costly." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Barrett's jaw tightened, his mind racing through every possibility. He didn't realize that his next move would not only determine the outcome of this encounter, but also unravel truths that would shake the very foundation of Legacy Trust Bank. Barrett stared at Sarah, his fingers still hovering near the silent alarm button. Her calm demeanor, her measured words, they only irritated him further. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with someone trying to pull a fast one. And in his mind, Sarah fit the profile. Confident, composed, and carrying a check worth more money than most people saw in a lifetime. It all seemed too good to be true. "I'm simply doing my job, Ms. Williams," he said, his voice clipped. "I'm sure you understand the need for caution in cases like these." Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. She crossed her legs, her movements deliberate and poised. "Of course, Mr. Barrett," she replied evenly. "But I hope your caution doesn't come at the expense of fairness." Barrett bristled at the subtle jab in her words. He tapped the check against the edge of his desk, glancing at her ID again. The name on the check matched the name on her driver's license, and everything appeared legitimate, but something still didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the money, it was her demeanor. She wasn't acting like someone who needed the bank's approval. If anything, she was behaving as though she were the one in charge. "Can you tell me a bit more about where this check came from?" Barrett asked, leaning forward slightly. "What's the nature of the transaction?" Sarah smiled faintly, as though she'd been expecting the question. "It's payment from a recent acquisition," she said. "One of my companies closed a deal earlier this week, and this is part of the settlement. I'm depositing it here because I've had an account with Legacy Trust for over a decade." Barrett's brow furrowed. Her explanation was clear and concise, yet it did nothing to ease his doubts. "A company, you say? And what kind of business are you in, Ms. Williams?" "I run several businesses," Sarah replied, her tone casual but not dismissive. "Real estate, tech investments, a few ventures in renewable energy. The company that issued this check specializes in financial software." Barrett nodded slowly, though inwardly he was growing more frustrated. Her answers were impeccable, leaving no room for error or suspicion. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation was wrong. He glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the time. It had been almost 20 minutes since Sarah had walked into the bank, and he still hadn't made a decision. "You'll understand, I'm sure, why I might need additional verification," Barrett said, reaching for the phone on his desk. "I'll need to contact the issuing bank directly to confirm the check's authenticity." Sarah's smile didn't waver. "Feel free," she said. "But before you make that call, I suggest you look up the account number on that check." Barrett hesitated, her words catching him off guard. There was something in her tone, something almost challenging. He turned the check over in his hands, his eyes scanning the fine print. The account number was printed clearly at the bottom, along with the routing number. It looked perfectly normal, yet her suggestion made him uneasy. With a sharp inhale, he typed the account number into his computer, accessing the bank's internal database. It only took a few seconds for the results to appear on his screen, but what he saw made his breath catch. The account wasn't just a business account, it was a master account, the kind reserved for the highest level of banking clients, those who controlled vast portfolios and handled sums that could fund small countries. Barrett's stomach dropped as he scrolled through the account details. The name listed on the account was Sarah Chen Williams. The transaction history was staggering, with amounts that dwarfed the check sitting on his desk. And then he saw it, the most recent entry. It wasn't just a deposit or a withdrawal. It was a transfer of ownership. He blinked, his mind racing to process the information. The transfer wasn't just for funds, it was for shares. Significant shares. Enough to suggest that Sarah wasn't just a client of Legacy Trust Bank. She was a major stakeholder. Perhaps even more than that. "What?" Barrett started, his voice faltering. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "What is this?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, though there was a glint of something in her eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or satisfaction. "You're starting to piece it together, aren't you?" she said quietly. Barrett stared at her, the weight of realization pressing down on him like a boulder. "Ms. Williams," he said, his voice low and strained, "what exactly is your relationship with this bank?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She let the question hang in the air, her gaze steady. "Why don't you tell me what you found?" she said finally. "I'm curious to hear your interpretation." Barrett swallowed hard, his palms suddenly clammy. He glanced at the silent alarm button again, his mind grappling with the implications of what he'd just uncovered. Sarah wasn't a fraud. She wasn't a con artist. She was something far more dangerous to his sense of authority, someone who didn't just outrank him, but owned the very institution he worked for. The realization left him reeling. He had made assumptions about her from the moment she walked through the door, and now those assumptions were crumbling under the weight of undeniable truth. Sarah Chen Williams wasn't just a successful businesswoman. She was a force to be reckoned with, a figure of power who could alter the course of his career with a single phone call. "Ms. Williams," he said again, his voice trembling slightly, "I believe I owe you an apology." Sarah's smile returned, but this time it carried a hint of steel. "That depends," she said. "Are you apologizing because you've realized who I am, or because you understand why your assumptions were wrong?" Barrett froze, the question slicing through him like a blade. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time in his career, he felt completely out of his depth, and the realization was both humbling and terrifying. Barrett's heart raced as he stared at Sarah, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, of being the authoritative figure behind the desk. Yet now, that control was slipping through his fingers, and the irony of the situation was almost unbearable. He had underestimated her, not just in terms of wealth or status, but in every way that mattered. Barrett started, but the words stuck in his throat. He cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. "You're right, Ms. Williams. I made assumptions that I shouldn't have. It was unprofessional and unfair." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She simply observed him, her silence more unnerving than anything she could have said. The seconds stretched, and Barrett found himself wondering what she was thinking. Was she angry, amused, disappointed? He couldn't tell, and that only made the situation worse. As the silence lingered, the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional murmur of voices from the lobby seemed magnified. Barrett felt exposed, like the entire bank was watching him fumble through this interaction. He'd forced himself to look at Sarah again, but her expression remained inscrutable. Finally, Sarah spoke, her tone measured but firm. "Mr. Barrett, let me ask you something. If I hadn't insisted that you check the account details, how far would you have gone to dismiss me? Would you have called security? Reported me to the authorities?" Barrett winced at the question, the shame settling in his chest like a stone. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd like to think I wouldn't have gone that far. But I can't say for sure." Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "That's what concerns me," she said. "Not just for myself, but for anyone who walks into this bank and doesn't fit your expectations. How many others have faced this kind of scrutiny simply because they didn't look the part?" Barrett opened his mouth to respond, but once again, no words came. He couldn't argue with her. He had seen it happen before. Clients being treated differently based on their appearance, their accents, their backgrounds. He had always told himself it wasn't personal, that it was just policy. But now, faced with the consequences of his own actions, those justifications felt hollow. Meanwhile, in the lobby, the tension was palpable. The staff had noticed the unusually long meeting in Barrett's office, and whispers were beginning to spread. Some of the tellers exchanged uneasy glances, while others tried to focus on their work, their curiosity simmering beneath the surface. One of the junior employees, a young woman named Lisa, couldn't help but feel uneasy. She had seen Sarah walk in earlier and had been struck by her confident demeanor. Now, watching from her desk, Lisa felt a growing sense of unease. Something about the way Barrett had reacted to Sarah didn't sit right with her, and she found herself silently rooting for the woman in the corner office. Back inside the office, Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the weight of Sarah's words sinking in. He wanted to fix this, to somehow make it right, but he didn't know where to begin. "Ms. Williams," he said hesitantly, I want to assure you that this isn't how we typically treat our clients. I made a mistake, and I'll do whatever I can to make it right. Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression softening just slightly. And what does making it right look like to you, Mr. Barrett? She asked. Is it an apology? A promise to do better? Or is it something more tangible? Barrett swallowed hard, the question catching him off guard. He hadn't thought that far ahead. I'm not sure, he admitted, but I'm willing to listen. If there's something I can do to rebuild your trust, I want to know. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving his. Trust isn't rebuilt with words, Mr. Barrett, she said. It's rebuilt with actions. And right now, what I want is for you to take a hard look at the way you approach your work. Not just with me, but with everyone who comes through those doors. Barrett nodded slowly, her words hitting him harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on being thorough, on following the rules. But now he realized that those rules weren't as impartial as he had thought. They were shaped by biases, his own and the system's. And those biases had consequences. As the conversation continued, Sarah's phone buzzed softly on the desk. She glanced at the screen, her expression unreadable, before tucking it back into her bag. Barrett couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in her demeanor, as though she were preparing for something. Is everything okay? He asked, the question sipping out before he could stop himself. Sarah smiled faintly, but there was something enigmatic in her expression. That depends, she said. You'll find out soon enough. Barrett felt a chill run down his spine at her words. There was an air of inevitability in her tone, as though she knew something he didn't. He glanced at the clock again, the minutes ticking by with agonizing slowness. Whatever was about to happen, he had the distinct feeling that it would change everything. Barrett felt the weight of the room closing in on him, the hum of the fluorescent lights growing louder in his ears. Sarah's calm yet commanding presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't used to this dynamic, a client holding the upper hand, especially one he had initially dismissed. Her words lingered, each one a small crack in the carefully constructed armor he wore every day. The muffled sound of the lobby door opening and closing reached his office, reminding him that the world outside was still moving. Yet inside this room, time felt suspended. Barrett noticed Sarah glance briefly at the frosted glass of the office door, her gaze steady but unreadable. Was she expecting someone? The thought stirred a flicker of unease in him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. I have one more question for you, Mr. Barrett, Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she were testing him. When you looked at me earlier, before you even checked my account, what went through your mind? What did you see? Barrett hesitated, his mind racing. He could feel the trap closing around him, the walls of his own assumptions closing in. He knew what she was asking, but how could he admit it without confirming everything she suspected? I saw someone I didn't recognize, he said finally, his voice uncertain. Someone unfamiliar. Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes that told him she wasn't satisfied. Unfamiliar, she repeated, her tone thoughtful. Is that all? Or did you see someone who didn't belong? Someone who didn't fit the image you've created for your clients? Barrett's stomach tightened. He wanted to protest, to deny it, but the truth was written all over his face. He had judged her the moment she walked in, let his assumptions dictate his actions. And now there was no way to take it back. Before he could respond, a knock on the door startled him. His assistant, a nervous young man named Ethan, peeked in, his face pale. Mr. Barrett, he said, glancing quickly at Sarah before looking back at his boss. There's someone here to see you. They said it's urgent. Barrett frowned, interruption adding to his growing unease. Who is it? He asked, his tone sharper than he intended. It's... Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to Sarah again. It's someone from the corporate office. Barrett's breath caught. Corporate. They never showed up unannounced. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Did this have something to do with Sarah? Had word already reached them about his mistake? He nodded stiffly, dismissing Ethan with a wave of his hand. "Send them in." Ethan disappeared, and moments later, the door opened again. A tall, impeccably dressed man stepped inside, his polished demeanor immediately commanding attention. Barrett recognized him instantly, Mr. Grant, one of the top executives at the bank. He had only met the man once before, but his reputation preceded him. "Mr. Barrett," Grant said smoothly, his gaze sweeping over the room before settling on Sarah. He smiled politely, though there was a sharpness in his eyes that Barrett didn't miss. "Ms. Williams, it's a pleasure to see you again." Sarah returned the smile, though hers held an unmistakable edge. "Mr. Grant, thank you for coming on such short notice." Barrett's heart sank. Short notice? What was going on? He glanced between the two of them, his confusion mounting. "You know each other?" he asked, his voice barely concealing his growing panic. Grant's smile didn't waver. "Oh yes, Ms. Williams and I go way back. She's one of our most valued clients, after all." He turned to Barrett, his tone turning colder. "I assume you've been treating her accordingly." Barrett opened his mouth, but no words came. The room seemed to tilt around him, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with horrifying clarity. Sarah wasn't just a client. She was someone important, someone with connections, someone who had the power to change everything. And he had dismissed her, humiliated her, all because of his own biases. Sarah crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Barrett and I have been having a very enlightening conversation," she said, her tone casual but loaded with implication. "I'm sure he has plenty to share about how he's been managing this branch." Grant's gaze sharpened, and Barrett felt the weight of it like a physical blow. "I see," Grant said slowly. "Well, I think it's time we hear the full story, don't you?" The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence stretching like a wire-pulled taut. Barrett felt trapped, caught in a web of his own making. He wanted to explain, to justify, but he knew it wouldn't matter. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. Barrett's throat tightened as the air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. His gaze darted from Grant to Sarah, both of whom now stood as if they were two judges presiding over his professional downfall. He wanted to plead his case, to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, but his words felt stuck, heavy with the weight of what he had done. Grant finally broke the silence, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge of authority. "Ms. Williams, perhaps you'd like to share your perspective on today's events. Transparency is vital in situations like these." Barrett felt a cold sweat form on the back of his neck as Sarah turned slightly toward Grant, her expression thoughtful. "Well," she began slowly, her voice steady, "it started the moment I walked into this branch. Mr. Barrett didn't even attempt to look at my check before assuming there was an issue. He dismissed me outright, questioning the validity of my claim, and when I insisted, he treated me as if I were a problem to be managed, not a client to be served." Barrett flinched at her words. They weren't exaggerated. In fact, they were painfully accurate. Still, hearing them spoken aloud felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He opened his mouth to interject, but Grant's raised hand silenced him before he could utter a single word. "Go on," Grant said, nodding for Sarah to continue. Sarah didn't hesitate. It was clear from his demeanor that he had made assumptions about me before I even said a word. He didn't see me as a person, Mr. Grant. He saw me as a stereotype, and he acted accordingly. She paused, her gaze sharp as it locked onto Barrett. I gave him every opportunity to correct his course, to treat me with the respect any client deserves. But he doubled down instead. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, and Barrett felt like he was sinking further into his chair. He wanted to argue to defend himself, but every excuse he could think of sounded hollow even in his own mind. Grant nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Ms. Williams. That aligns with some concerns we've been hearing from other branches regarding client relations and bias. It's unfortunate to see those concerns validated in such a clear way." Barrett's head shot up, his heart pounding. Other branches. He blurted out before he could stop himself. The idea that this might be part of a larger investigation hadn't even occurred to him. Suddenly, his small corner of the banking world felt a lot less isolated. Grant turned his attention to Barrett, his gaze piercing. "Yes, Mr. Barrett. We've been monitoring complaints and patterns across several of our branches, and your name has come up more than once. Today's incident might be the most egregious, but it's certainly not the only issue we're dealing with." Barrett's stomach dropped. He could feel the walls closing in, the career he had built crumbling before his eyes. But before he could process the full weight of Grant's words, Sarah spoke again, her tone thoughtful. "Mr. Grant," she said, "I think there's something else you should know." She reached into her bag, pulling out a slim folder. She handed it to Grant, who opened it with a curious expression. His eyes scanned the contents, and for the first time since entering the room, his composed demeanor faltered. Barrett watched nervously as Grant's brow furrowed, his lips pressing into a thin line. "This," Grant began, his voice trailing off as he flipped through the papers. He looked up at Sarah, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "This changes everything." Sarah nodded. "I thought it might. That's why I called you here today." Barrett's anxiety skyrocketed. He had no idea what was in that folder, but it was clear that whatever it wasn't good news for him. He tried to keep his composure, but his mind was racing, desperate to piece together what was happening. Grant closed the folder and set it on the desk, his gaze now colder than ever as he looked at Barrett. "Mr. Barrett, it seems there are additional discrepancies in your management of this branch. Discrepancies that go beyond today's incident. Ms. Williams has provided documentation that raises serious questions about your practices, and I can assure you these matters will be investigated thoroughly." Barrett's mouth went dry. He wanted to protest, to claim he was being set up. But the truth was, he had been cutting corners for months, assuming no one would notice. He never imagined someone like Sarah Williams would be the one to expose him. Sarah stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "This isn't just about me, Mr. Barrett. It's about every client who has walked into this branch and been treated as less than they deserve. It's about accountability and ensuring that people like you don't get to decide who is worthy of respect." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy fog. Barrett felt utterly defeated, his world unraveling piece by piece. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder what Sarah's next move would be. She had already turned his life upside down, but it was clear she wasn't finished yet.